The 3rd of May, Bistritz left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46 p.m., but train was an hour late. From Jonathan Harker's journal. Thus begins the lines of a great work of fiction that would come to capture the hearts and blood of the world. But was it really the beginning? Was it really even fiction? And what was the novel really telling us in between the lines? The answers are stranger than fiction, even if this book might not be. The seeds of this story extend at least 600 years or more back into the past, but it took a fertile mind to cause those seeds to start to sprout over 130 years ago, when a middle-aged man is sent on a quest to find a book and found a monster. It really all began when Abraham and Charlotte gave birth to a son on November 8, 1847, in Dublin, Ireland, who they named Abraham as well. Young Abraham, the third of 7 children, was a sickly child and was bedridden with an unknown illness until he started school at the age of 7, when he made a complete recovery. Of this time Abraham wrote, "I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of a long illness gave the opportunity for many thoughts which were fruitful according to their kind in later years." He would outgrow his weakness to become an outstanding athlete and football, aka soccer, player at Trinity College from 1864 to 1870 in Dublin, where he earned a degree in mathematics. He was auditor of the College Historical Society and president of the University Philosophical Society. He remains the only student in Trinity's history to hold both positions. But 3 of his brothers wanted to attend medical school, so the young man was asked to start work with his father as a petty sessions clerk in the civil service at Dublin Castle. He became interested in the theatre while a student through his friend Dr. Monsell. While working for the Irish Civil Service, he became the unpaid theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, which was co-owned by Sheridan Le Fanu, a renowned author of Gothic tales centered to the development of the genre in the Victorian era. One of his books being the acclaimed Camilla, a lesbian vampire story. That unpaid job would forever change the course of Abraham's life. Theater critics were held in low esteem, but he attracted notice by the quality of his reviews. In December of 1876, he gave a favorable review of Henry Irving's Hamlet at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. Irving invited Abraham for dinner at the Shelbourne Hotel where he was staying, and they became friends. In 1878, he married Florence Balcombe, former fiancée of Oscar Wilde, who was overtly homosexual, a crime to the British at that time, and later jailed for it. Oddly though, Abraham and Florence remained friends with him and his family. The young couple moved to London, where Abraham became acting manager and then business manager of Irving's Lyceum Theatre in London, a post he held for 27 years. On the 1st of December of 1879, Bram and Florence's only child was born from an almost sexless marriage, a son whom they christened Irving Noel Thornley. The collaboration with Henry Irving was an important one for Abraham, and through him he was involved in London's high society, where he met James Abbott McNeill Whistler, painter of Arrangement in Grey and Black No. 1, but which was usually referred to as Whistler's mother, as well as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to whom he was distantly related. Working for Irving, the most famous actor of his time, and managing one of the most successful theatres in London, made him a notable, if busy, man, giving him no time to deal with his inner struggles. He was dedicated to Irving, and his memoirs show how he idolized him. In London, Abraham also met Hall Caine, who became one of his closest friends. He dedicated his most appraised novel to him. In the course of Irving's tours, Abraham traveled the world, although he never visited Eastern Europe, a setting for his most famous novel. Abraham enjoyed the United States, where Irving was popular. With Irving, he was invited twice to the White House and knew William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. Abraham set two of his novels in America and used Americans as characters, the most notable being Quincy Morris. He also met one of his literary idols, Walt Whitman, and became friends with Samuel Langhorne Clemens, aka Mark Twain. By 1890, in spite of his job at the theater, personal assistant to Henry Irving, and part-time writing, Abraham was in financial trouble. He entered into a partnership for the International Library, but the enterprise had failed, and he lost his investment. Also, a 20-share investment in Page Compositor Manufacturing, to which his friend, Mark Twain, had bought all rights, turned out to be a financial disaster. He was forced to borrow £600 from his best friend, Hall Caine, and had to sign over a life insurance policy to pay him back. It was at a dinner at the Beefsteak Club of the Lyceum Theatre in London that Professor Amen Vambery, a Hungarian Turkologist, linguist, and traveler from Budapest University, told the acting manager Abraham of a book, told him what to look for, and told him to visit the library in Whitby. It's also believed that during their discussion, Armin told him about one of the best-known figures of Romanian history, Vlad Dracula, nicknamed Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, who was the ruler of Wallachia at various times from 1456 to 1462. Born in 1431 in Sighisoara, he resided all his adult life in Wallachia, except for periods of imprisonment at Pest and Visegrad in Hungary. He was the second son of the nobleman Vlad II Dracul, and took the name Dracula, meaning son of Dracul, when he was initiated into a secret order of Christian knights known as the Order of the Dragon. As the ruler of Wallachia, now part of Romania, Vlad Tepes became notorious for the brutal tactics he employed against his enemies, including torture, mutilation, and mass murder. Though he didn't shy away from disembowelment, decapitations, or boiling or skinning his victims alive. His preferred method was impalement or driving a wooden stake through their bodies and leaving them to die of exposure. During his campaign against Ottoman invaders in 1462, Vlad reportedly had as many as 20,000 victims impaled on the banks of the Danube River. Captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned, he was finally able to regain his seat in 1476, only to be killed in battle the same year. Some particularly gruesome accounts claim that Vlad liked to dine amongst the impaled bodies of his victims, and would even dip his bread into their blood. In Romanian, Dracul means dragon. Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil. Wallachians were accustomed to giving it as a surname to any person who rendered himself conspicuous either by courage, cruel actions, or cunning. In Abraham's home country of Ireland, Dracula is literally translated into Gaelic as Drac Ula, meaning bad blood. These gory details, as well as his legally adopted name, Dracula, and his birthplace of Transylvania, have convinced many scholars that Vlad the Impaler provided partial inspiration for Abraham's famous antagonist. Now, all this information that Armin had provided was literary fodder for the part-time writer. For 4 months, ideas began swirling around in Abraham's head. A story began forming, and he did not waste time in writing down ideas. He had been supplementing his income from the theater by writing romance and sensation novels, and by this time he already had 13 books published. In the first extensive study of the notes, Joseph S. Bierman writes that the earliest date within them is the 8th of March, 1890, for an outline of a chapter that differs from the final version in only a few details. Naturally, this book Armin had told him about piqued his curiosity, and months later he found himself in Whitby. Whitby is a seaside port town, very picturesque, with its own natural atmosphere. Its east cliff is home to the ruins of Whitby Abbey, where Caedmon, the earliest recognized English poet, lived and where Captain James Cook learned seamanship. It was during the summer months of 1890 when the 45-year-old writer entered the subscription library in Whitby, England, and requested that specific title, The Accounts of Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. This wasn't a title found readily on the shelves or typically made available to the general public. The library didn't even make it known they possessed the rare copy. Access was only granted to those who asked for it. Patrons handled the title only under the watchful eye of the librarian, and it was returned to its resting place the moment business concluded. Upon receipt of the book, Abraham, who had joined the London Library just that year, he was proposed for membership by Hall Caine and had started paying his fees. The man didn't read this travel book cover to cover or browse the text to a specific location, made notes in his journal, and, as it would turn out, in the book itself, and returned the tome to the librarian. He'd never visited Transylvania in person, instead using contemporary travel books to form the backdrop for his story. He stopped next at the Whitby Museum, where he reviewed a series of maps and pieced together a route beginning in the heart of London and ending upon a mountaintop deep within the wilds of Romania, a latitude and longitude previously noted in his journal and confirmed again this very day. From the museum, Abraham then made his way to Whitby Harbor, where he spoke to several members of the Royal Coast Guard. They provided details of a sailing vessel, the Dimitri, that ran aground a few years earlier on the beach inside the protective harbor, with only a few handful of the remaining crew alive. The ship, which originated in Varna, an Eastern European port, was carrying a mysterious cargo, crates of earth. While investigating the damaged ship, rescue workers reported seeing a large black dog, consistent with a Yorkshire myth of a beast known as Barghast, escaped from the hull of the ship and run up the 199 steps from Tate Sands Beach into the graveyard of St. Mary's Church. Abraham looked up at the church, at Whitby Abbey, looming beside it on the cliff. In his mind's eye, he pictured a dark chamber at the top of the central tower. The final piece of a decade-old puzzle, a story, slowly taking shape. That night, opening his journal, he turned to the information he'd written down back at the library and compared them to the rough story outline he'd written down before arriving in Whitby. On a page of his outline, the name Count Wampir appears. He crossed it out, replaced with Count Dracula. And to the writer, it all made sense now. For fans of the novel Dracula, the information above takes on a familiar note. We all know the name. There's the graveyard, the abbey, the dog, and of course, the ship. But it was called the Demeter, right? Not Dimitri. In the book, yes, but in real life, it was Dimitri, and there was a real life. Abraham had found a blurry place between fact and fiction, and that surely put a smile on the Irishman's face. But that smile would not last. Abraham was a regular visitor to Cruden Bay in Scotland between 1893 and 1910. His month-long holidays to that Aberdeenshire coast village provided a large portion of available time for writing his books. 2 novels were set in Cruden Bay. He started writing Dracula there in 1895 while in residence at the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel. The nearby Slains Castle, also known as New Slains Castle, is linked with Abraham to this day and plausibly provided the visual palette for the description of Castle Dracula during the writing phase. A distinctive room in Slains Castle, the Octagon Hall, matches the description of the Octagon Room in Castle Dracula. H.P. Lovecraft coyly wrote that he knew, air quotations, an old lady who was approached to revise the original manuscript, but that Abraham found her too expensive. In 1896, Irving badly injured his knee, putting him out of acting for 10 weeks, destroying that winter season. By 1897, the manuscript was complete to Abraham's satisfaction, and that's where the novel Dracula as we know it is today, right? Most people thought so, except for the people of Iceland. They know another version of Dracula. The problem was that Dracula was relatively unknown in Iceland until the release of Universal's Dracula in 1931. Iceland was working to encourage its citizens to be more interested in Icelandic books up until that point. In spite of that, Mark Twain believed it was in Abraham's best interest to have the book published in Icelandic, which Abraham did. Abraham supplied his translator with his original manuscript version. Except for various reasons, the translator made up a few changes to fit the Icelandic readers, but we're certain that it's the original approved story because Abraham approved it and even wrote a foreword to that version. Apparently he didn't mind a few alterations. In the Icelandic version, called Makt Myrkrana, Powers of Darkness, include this passage. I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatsoever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might seem at first sight, and I am further convinced they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible. He went on to claim that many of the characters in his novel were real people. All of the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Thomas, aka Jonathan Harker, and his wife, Wilhelmina, aka Mina, who is a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends, and they have been so for many years, and I have never doubted that they were telling the truth, and, for obvious reasons, he had changed the names of places and people. Was Van Helsing real? Not Helsing, but Hellwing. It is known that while writing about Van Helsing, Abraham could have had a real person in mind. A researcher named Wigtowski claimed he had found out that Stoker's model was in fact a Lutheran pastor named Hellwing, who 300 years ago studied vampires and werewolves. You see, Abraham did not intend for Dracula to serve as fiction, but as a warning of a very real evil, a childhood nightmare all too real. Although scholars have been aware of the translation's existence since the 1980s because of Stoker's preface, none had thought to translate it back into English. Makt Myrkrana differs significantly. Character names were different, the length was abridged, and it was more overtly sexual than the original. Why the change in the English version? Abraham had to. When he presented it to his publisher in 1897, worried of the impact of presenting such a story as true, his editor, Otto Kielman, of Archibald Constable and Company, returned the manuscript with a single word of his own. No. He went on to explain that London was still recovering from a spate of horrible murders in Whitechapel, aka Jack the Ripper, and with the killer still on the loose, they couldn't publish such a story without running the risk of generating mass panic. Changes would need to be made, factual elements would need to come out, and it would be published as fiction or not at all. As they were his editors, Abraham relented, and Dracula was published on May 26, 1897. It cost 6 shillings and was bound in yellow cloth and titled in red letters. When the novel was finally released, the first 101 to 124 pages, depending on how you count, had been cut out. Numerous alterations had been made to the text, and the epilogue had been shortened, changing Dracula's ultimate fate as well as that of his castle. Tens of thousands of words had vanished. Bram's message, once concise and clear, had blurred between the remaining lines. Charlotte gushed about the novel to the author, predicting it would bring him great immense financial success. She was wrong. The novel, although reviewed well, did not make Stoker much money and did not cement his critical legacy until after his death. From the Daily Mail, June 1st, 1897. Upon publication, Dracula was well received. An anonymous writer described Abraham as the Edgar Allan Poe of the 90s. The 1890s, that is. Other favorable comparisons to other Gothic novelists included the Bronte sisters and Mary Shelley. Many of these early reviews were charmed by Abraham's unique treatment of the vampire myth. One called it the best vampire story ever written. The Daily Telegraph's reviewer noted that while earlier Gothic works, like The Castle of Otranto, kept the supernatural far away from the novelist's home countries, Dracula's horrors occurred both in foreign lands, in the faraway Carpathian Mountains, and at home in Whitby and Hampstead Heath. They were less fond of the parts set in England, finding the vampires suited better to tales set far away from home. The British magazine Vanity Fair noted that the novel was at times unintentionally funny, pointed to Dracula's disdain for garlic. Dracula was widely considered to be frightening. A review appearing in the Manchester Guardian in 1897 praised this capacity to entertain, but concluded that Stoker erred in including so much horror. Likewise, Vanity Fair opined that the novel was praiseworthy and absorbing, but could not recommend it to those who are not strong. A reviewer for the San Francisco Wave called the novel a literary failure. They elaborated that coupling vampires with frightening imagery, such as insane asylums and unnatural appetites, made the horror too overt, and that other works in the genre, such as The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, had more restraint. Modern critics frequently write that Dracula had a mixed critical reception upon publication. Other critical works have rejected the narrative of Dracula's mixed response. Raymond T. McNally and Radu Florescu's In Search of Dracula mention the novel's immediate success. Other works about Dracula, coincidentally, also published in 1972, concur. Gabriel Ronet said the novel was recognized by fans and critics alike as a horror writer's stroke of genius. And Anthony Masters mentions the novel's enormous popular appeal. Since the 1970s, Dracula has been the subject of significant academic interest, evidenced by its own peer-reviewed journal and the numerous books and articles discussing the novel. This raises a question, though. What was on the first 101 pages or so? What was considered too real, too frightening for publication? The writer left breadcrumbs. You need only know where to look. Some of those clues were discovered in a recently translated first edition of Dracula from Iceland. Within that first edition, Abraham left not only his original preface intact, but parts of his original story outside the reach of his UK publisher. More can be found within the short story Dracula's Guest, now known to have been excised from the original text. Then there were his notes, his journals, other first editions worldwide. Unable to tell his story as a whole, he spread it out where, much like his famous vampire, it never died, only slept, waited. In 1898, a fire destroyed many of the props and sets used for regular production. Its golden days were gone. In 1899, the first American edition of Dracula was published by Doubleday and McClure, New York. In it, Abraham decided that he could take some liberties and make the American version more sexual and homoerotic. In the British version of the text, Harker hears the three vampire women whispering at his door, and Dracula tells them they can feed on him tomorrow night. In the American version, Dracula insinuates that he will be feeding on Harker that night. Tonight is mine. Tomorrow is yours. Abraham thought the line would render his novel unpublishable in 1897 England, and that the America that produced his hero, Walt Whitman, would have been more tolerant of men feeding on men. That year Irving developed pleurisy, and that same year he transferred the deed of the theater over to a consortium without consulting Abraham. Irving's manager hoped that transferring to a literary career might offer a financial safety net. Then Henry Irving died in 1905, which ended Abraham's position as Lyceum's manager of nearly 30 years. He published his personal remembrances of Henry Irving in 1906 after Irving's death, which proved successful and managed productions at the Prince of Wales Theatre. He suffered a stroke shortly afterwards and spent much of his final years battling through poor health and shaky financial footing. Prior to writing Dracula, Stoker researched extensively, assembling over 100 pages of notes, including chapter summaries and plot outlines. The notes were sold by Abraham's widow Florence after his death in 1913 to a New York book dealer for £2 2 shillings. Following that, the notes became the property of Charles Scribner's sons, and then disappeared until they were bought by the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia in 1970. According to Bierman, Abraham always intended to write an epistolary novel, but with an original setting of Styria instead of Transylvania. This itineration did not explicitly use the word vampire. Abraham's notes illuminate much about earlier iterations of the novel. For instance, they indicate that the novel's vampire was intended to be a count even before he was given the name Dracula. Abraham's initial plans for Dracula markedly differ from the final novel. Had he completed his original plans, a German professor called Max Winchufel would have confronted Count Wampir from Styria, and one of the crew of Light would have been slain by a werewolf. Abraham's earliest note indicate that Dracula might have originally been intended to be a detective story, with a detective called Cotford and a psychic investigator called Singleton. The first film to feature Count Dracula was Karoli Lathai's Dracula Halala, The Death of Dracula, a Hungarian silent film released in 1921. Very little of the film has survived, and David J. Scowl notes that the cover artist for the 1926 Hungarian version of the film was more influenced by the second adaptation of Dracula, F. W. Murnau's Nosferatu. One of the suggested etymologies for Nosferatu, by the way, is that it was derived from the Romanian Nesferit, meaning offensive or unbearable. Critic Wayne Hensley writes that the film's narrative differs significantly from the novel and that the characters have clear counterparts. Abraham's widow, Florence, initiated legal action against the film studio Prana. The legal case lasted 2 or 3 years, and in May of 1924, Prana agreed to destroy all copies of the film. But Nosferatu had made it to the United States, where Dracula was already in the public domain. So duplicates were created, and thus Nosferatu survived. In the 1930s, when Universal Studios purchased the rights to make a film version, it was discovered that Abraham had not fully complied with U.S. copyright laws, placing the novel into the public domain. You see, the novelist was required to purchase the original copyright and registered 2 copies, but he only registered 1. Now let's jump ahead nearly 50 years to the 1980s. The original Dracula typescript was discovered in a barn in rural northwestern Pennsylvania. That typescript, now owned by Microsoft's co-founder Paul Allen, begins on page 102. Jonathan Harker's journey on a train, once thought to be the beginning of the story, was actually in the thick of it. It appears that shortly after publication, Abraham gave the only known typescript to Colonel Thomas C. Donaldson, Esquire, of Philadelphia, a close friend and biographer of Walt Whitman's. After Whitman's death, according to his wishes, Donaldson gave Abraham the original notes from Whitman's 1886 lecture on Abraham Lincoln. During one of his visits with Whitman, the men discovered they shared a common interest in Lincoln. Donaldson passed away in 1898, and Henkel sold his extensive collection of manuscripts and letters. Nobody knows how it made its way across the Atlantic, coming to be left in a barn. Then, in a final twist of irony, Abraham's novel was not published in Romania, Dracula's homeland, until 1990. Then criminal activity was recently discovered in 2018. It's a crime that libraries considered the most heinous of all. The unhinged playwright Joe Orton even went to jail for it. No, there's no excuse for defacing books. Except that the London Library in Mayfair is now rather pleased that one of its former members appeared to have done just that. 28 of the books Abraham had used for research at the library while writing Dracula, says head Library Development Director Philip Spedding. While Abraham's name may have been revered in the literary world, in fact, he wasn't a natural talent when it came to pen and paper. He was a dreadful writer. His other stuff is dreadful, says Spedding. Dracula was to become the exception to the rule. Amongst the books that Abraham is thought to have borrowed while researching Dracula is the Book of Werewolves by Reverend Sabine Baring Gould. The library's copy is littered with pencil marks closely correlating with a transcription of Abraham's Dracula notes. On page 17 of the very book Armin had previously sent him for, the corner had been turned over, and on that same page the word Dracula appears. Spooky coincidence? Probably not. Copies of books known to have belonged to Abraham have been treated with equal disregard by the writer. Not all his books have been page-turners, but he was guilty of being a page-turner himself. So what does Spedding make of Dracula as a novel? It's a perfectly acceptable book, he says dryly, adding that Stoker's real genius was to tie in mythology with reality, to create something believable. It's easy to forget that Abraham used cutting-edge technology, such as the phonograph, in Dracula to heighten the realism. Dracula is indisputably his best novel. In the time he took to write it, between 1890 and 1897, Abraham rattled off another 3, albeit bad, novels. Something in the writer urged him to put in the heavy-duty research and keep plugging away. Now, we can't be 100% sure that these are Abraham's notes. The library had never kept borrowing records, but the coincidences are uncanny. In 1897, Abraham wrote a letter to his bankers, Coutts, ordering them to stop payment to the London Library as he was leaving. This coincides with the date he published Dracula. His work here was done. And with his publication, Dracula launched an entire genre of literary and film about vampires, those sinister figures who use their supernatural powers to hunt humans and drink their blood. Vampires, werewolves, and the like were a common subject in Abraham's day, but for whatever reason, it was Dracula which channeled all this into the quintessential book. So what was it about Dracula that's so endearing to us, almost 130 years after its publication? For Spedding, it's that Abraham's blood-sucking character is infinitely reinterpretable from generation to generation. Hotel Transylvania 3 came out this year. It did 500 million business, said Spedding. Indeed, from Christopher Lee's 1950s Draculas to the 1972 blaxploitation film Blackula, two recent kids' movies, Abraham's creation continues to stalk us all. Dracula is one of the most famous pieces of English literature, and many of the book's characters have entered popular culture as archetypal versions of their characters. For example, Count Dracula as a quintessential vampire and Abraham Van Helsing as an iconic vampire hunter. Aside from the historical Count Dracula also has literary progenitors. The Vampire is a short work of prose fiction written in 1819 by John William Polidori, taken from the story Lord Byron told as part of a contest amongst Polidori, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley. The same contest produced Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Varney the Vampire or The Feast of Blood was a serialized Gothic horror story variously attributed to James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Becket Prest, first appearing in 1845 to 1847 as a series of weekly cheap pamphlets of the kind then known as penny dreadfuls. It was filled with sexual innuendos aimed at the general public. While not the first piece of literature to depict vampires, the novel has nonetheless come to dominate both popular and scholarly treatment of vampire fiction. Count Dracula is the first character to come to mind when people discuss vampires. Dracula succeeded by drawing together folklore, legend, vampire fiction, and the conventions of the Gothic novel. It profoundly shaped the popular understanding of how vampires function, including their strengths, weaknesses, and other characteristics. Bats had been associated with vampires before Dracula as a result of the vampire bat's existence, but Stoker deepened the association by making Dracula able to transform into one. That was, in turn, quickly taken up by film studios looking for opportunities to use special effects. Patrick McGrath notes that many of the Count's characteristics have been adopted by artists succeeding Abraham in depicting vampires, turning those fixtures into cliches. Aside from the Count's ability to transform, McGrath specifically highlights his hatred of garlic, sunlight, and crucifixes. Even the modern horror writer Stephen King has dipped his toes into the Dracula pool of blood. He made a hit of his early novel, Salem's Lot, when an idea came to him while he was teaching high school. One of the books covered in his course was Dracula, and that made King wonder, what if Dracula came back in 20th century America? The idea was jokingly kicked around by his wife, and the topic pretty much fell dormant. However, it continued to kick around in King's brain. After further discussion with his wife, it was decided that a small-town setting would fit the returning of Vampire Lord better. The hustle and bustle of the big city would be too much of a shock and a stark difference, but a small rural town would be much more suited for the returning vampire. With that in mind, the idea of Jerusalem's Lot was set. Ironically, when the movie was made, the main vampire was made to resemble the Nosferatu from 1926. Academic Elizabeth Signoretti argues that Dracula is a response to the lesbian vampire of his former employers at the newspaper, Sheridan Le Fanu's Camilla, 1872, correcting, in air quotes, its emphasis on female desire. Abraham's great-nephew, broadcaster Daniel Farson, wrote a biography of the author. In it, he notes Camilla influenced him profoundly. Farson writes that an inscription upon a tomb in Dracula is a direct allusion to Carmilla. Scholar Alison Milbank observed that as Dracula can transform into a dog, Camilla can become a cat. According to author Patrick McGrath, traces of Carmilla can be found in the 3 female vampires residing in Dracula's castle. A short story, written by Abraham and published after his death, called Dracula's Guest, has been seen as evidence of Carmilla's influence. According to Milbank, the story was a deleted first chapter from early in the original manuscript and replicates Carmilla's setting of Styria instead of Transylvania. Sexuality and seduction are 2 of the novel's most frequently discussed themes, especially as it relates to the corruption of English womanhood. Modern critical writings about vampirism widely acknowledge its link to sex and sexuality. Abraham himself was possibly homosexual. Talia Schaefer points to an intensely homoerotic letter sent by him to the American poet Walt Whitman. Abraham poured forth a long stream of sentiment cascading through various emotions, surging confidence bordering on hubris, delicate self-doubt, absolute artist-to-artist adoration, channeled with the breathless intensity of a love letter. He wrote to Whitman, "How sweet a thing is it for a strong, healthy man, with a woman's eye and a child's wishes, to feel that he can speak to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul." Abraham began writing the novel 1 month following the imprisonment of his friend Oscar Wilde for homosexuality. The novel's characters are often said to represent transgressive sexuality through the performance of their genders. The primary sexual threat posed by Count Dracula is, as Christopher Kraft writes, that he will seduce, penetrate, and drain another male, with Jonathan Harker's excitement about being penetrated by 3 female vampires serving as a mask and proxy for his homosexual desire. His excitement also inverts standard Victorian gender roles. In succumbing to the women vampire, Harker assumes the traditionally feminine role of sexual passivity, while the vampire women assume the masculinized role of being active. Sexual depravity and aggression were understood by the Victorians as the exclusive domain of Victorian men, while women were expected to submit to their husbands' sexual wishes. Harker's desire to submit, and the scene's origin as a dream Abraham had, highlights the divide between societal expectations and the lived realities of men who wanted more freedom in their sexual lives. Now, the novel's depiction of women continue to divide critics. Elaine Showalter writes that Lucy Westerna and Mina Harker represent different aspects of the new woman. According to Showalter, Lucy represents the sexual daring of the new woman, evidenced by how she wonders why a woman cannot marry 3 men if they all desire her. Mina, meanwhile, represents the new woman's intellectual ambitions, citing her occupation as a schoolmaster, her keen mind, and her knowledge of shorthand. Carol A. Stempf writes that Abraham was ambivalent about the new woman phenomena. Of the novel's 5 vampires, 4 are women, and all are aggressive, wildly erotic, and driven only by their thirst for blood. Mina Harker, meanwhile, serves as the antithesis of the other female characters and plays a singularly important role in Dracula's defeat. On the other hand, Judith Wasserman argues that the fight to defeat Dracula is really a battle for control over women's bodies. Senf points out that Lucy's sexual awakening and her reversal of gender-based stereo roles is what Abraham Van Helsing considers a threat. The novel's depiction of Slovaks and Romani people has attracted some, albeit limited, scholarly attention. Peter Arns wrote that the Count's control over the Romani and his abduction of young children evoke real folk superstitions about Romani people stealing children and the vampiric strigoi. His ability to transform into a wolf is likewise related to xenophobic beliefs about the Romani as animalistic. Although vagrants of all kinds were associated with animals, the Romani were victims of persecution in Europe due to a belief that they enjoyed unclean meat and lived among animals. Abraham's description of the Slovaks draws heavily from a travel memoir by a British major. Unlike the major's description, Harker's description is overtly imperialistic, labeling the people as barbarians and their boats as primitive, emphasizing their perceived cultural inferiority. Now, Stephen Arata describes the novel as a case of reverse colonization, and that is a fear of the non-white invading England and weakening its racial purity. Arata describes that the novel's cultural contest of mounting anxiety in Britain over the decline of the British Empire, the rise of other world powers, and a growing domestic unease over the morality of imperial colonization, manifesting also in other works aside from Abraham's novel. What Dracula does to human bodies is not horrifying simply because he kills them, but because he transforms them into the other. The novel's representation of vampirism has been discussed as symbolizing Victorian anxieties about disease. The theme is discussed with far less frequency than others because it is discussed alongside other topics, rather than as the central object of discussion. For example, some connect its depiction of disease with race and prejudice. In contrast, Matthias Classen writes parallels between vampirism and sexually transmitted diseases, specifically syphilis. Martin Willis, a researcher focused on the intersection of literature and disease, argues that the novel's characterization of vampirism makes it both the initial infection and resulting illness. As an epistolary novel, Dracula is narrated through a series of documents. The novel's first 4 chapters are related as the journals of Jonathan Harker. Scholar David Seed notes that Harker's accounts function as an attempt to translocate the strange events of his visit to Dracula's castle into the 19th century tradition of travelogue writing. John Seward, Mina Murray, and Jonathan Harker all keep a crystalline account of the period as an act of self-preservation. David Seed notes that Harker's narrative is written in shorthand to remain inscrutable to the Count, protecting his own identity, which Dracula threatens to destroy. Harker's journal, for example, embodies the only advantage during his stay at Dracula's castle, that he knows more than the Count thinks he does. The novel's disparate accounts approach a kind of narrative unity as the narrative unfolds. In the novel's first half, each narrator has a strongly characterized narrative voice, with Lucy's showing her verbosity, Seward's businesslike formality, and Harker's excessive politeness. These narrative styles also highlight the power struggle between Vampire and his hunters. The increasing prominence of Van Helsing's broken English as Dracula gathers power represents the entrance of the foreigner into Victorian society. Dracula is a common reference text in discussions of Gothic fiction. Gerald E. Hoggle notes Gothic fiction's tendency to blur boundaries, pointing to sexual orientation, race, class, and even species. Relating this to Dracula, he highlights that the Count can disgorge blood from his breasts. In addition to his teeth, That is, he is attracted to both Jonathan Harker and Mina Murray, appears both racially Western and Eastern, and how he is an aristocrat able to mingle with homeless vagrants. Abraham drew extensively from folklore in crafting Count Dracula, but many of the Count's physical attributes were typical of Gothic villains during Abraham's lifetime. In particular, his hooked nose, pale complexion, large mustache, and thick eyebrows were likely inspired by the villains of Gothic fiction. Likewise, Abraham's selection of Transylvania has its roots in the Gothic. Writers of the mode were drawn to Eastern Europe as a setting because travelogues represented it as a land of primitive superstition. Dracula deviates from Gothic tales before it firmly establishes its time, that being the modern era. Dracula became the subject of critical interest into Irish fiction during the early 1990s. Dracula is set largely in England, but Abraham was born in Ireland, which was at that time part of the British Empire, and lived there for the first 30 years of his life. As a result, a significant body of writing exists on Dracula, Ireland, England, and colonialism. Calvin W. Keogh writes that Harker's voyage into Eastern Europe bears comparison with the Celtic fringe into the West, highlighting them both as othered spaces. In this reading, Transylvania functions as a stand-in for Ireland. Several critics have described Count Dracula as an Anglo-Irish landlord. Dracula has been adapted a large number of times across virtually all forms of media. The novel and its characters have been adapted for film, television, video games, and animation over 700 times, with nearly 1,000 additional appearances in comic books and on the stage. Robert Fernandez Retamar deemed Count Dracula, along with the characters such as Frankenstein's monster, Mickey Mouse, and Superman, to be part of the hegemonic Anglo-Saxon world's cinematic fodder. Across the world, completed new adaptations can be produced as often as every week. It was Abraham who, though, wrote the first theatrical adaptation, which was presented at the Lyceum Theatre on May 18, 1897, under the title Dracula, or The Undead. Shortly after the novel's publication, it was performed only once in order to establish his own copyright for such adaptations. Although the manuscript was believed lost, the British Library possesses a copy. It consists of extracts from the novel's gallery proof, with Abraham's own handwriting providing direction and dialogue attribution. Visual representations of the Count have changed significantly over time. Early treatment of Dracula's appearance were established by theatrical productions in London and New York. Later prominent portrayals of the character by Bela Lugosi in a 1931 adaptation, and Christopher Lee, first in the 1958 film and later in its sequels, built upon earlier versions. Chiefly, Dracula's early visual style invoked a black-red collar scheme and slicked-back hair. Lee's portrayal was overtly sexual and also popularized fangs on screen. Gary Oldman's portrayal of Count Dracula in 1992 established a new default look for the character, a Romanian accent and long hair. The assortment of adaptations feature many different dispositions and characteristics of the Count and have contributed to his enduring popularity. Even within academic discussions, the boundaries between Abraham's novel and the character's adaptations across the range of media have effectively been blurred. Abraham's great-grandnephew, Dacre, suggests that Abraham's failure to comply with United States copyright law contributed to its enduring status, writing that writers and producers did not need to pay a license fee to use the characters. Abraham, aka Bram Stoker, died on April 20th, 1912. He had published 18 books by his death. After suffering a number of strokes, at number 26, St. George Square, London. Some biographers attribute the cause of death to overwork, others to tertiary syphilis. His death certificate named the cause of death locomotor ataxia 6 months, with various reports citing the cause as complications from a stroke, exhaustion, or syphilis. Paul Kane, his friend, wrote an obituary for him in the Daily Telegraph saying that, besides his biography on Irving, Abraham wrote only to sell and had no higher aims. He was cremated and his ashes were placed on a display urn at Golden Green Crematorium in northern London. His death was overshadowed by the sinking of the Titanic, which occurred the same week. Dracula was Abraham's 17th published book. Since its publication, Dracula has never been out of print. Like its namesake, it will live forever. And now you know the rest of the story.
There's nothing I can do, a total eclipse of the heart. Once upon a time there was light in my life, but now there's only love in the dark. Nothing I can say, a total eclipse of the heart. Every now and then There's nothing I can do. A total eclipse of the heart.